Hi, today what we're going to do is continue our introduction into symbolic contractionism. And what we'll be doing specifically today is looking at the different methods and different theories in terms of approaching the symbolic interactionism, as a kind of subfield of social psychology. So basically, how we approach different methods of collecting data, how we approach kind of interpreting that data when we're using the symbolic contractions framework. So to recap some of the key ideas from our last class, we started by basically unpacking, some of the key ideas and key principles of symbolic contractionism. Key ideas basically, we are born into the world without knowledge. We have to acquire knowledge. We have to acquire meaning through socialization, through learning. And then what we do, we take those meanings that we learn and we use those meanings to interpret the social world. And based upon our interpretations, based upon the meanings that we have, those will influence, those will shape kind of how we act, what we do, what we don't do, how we feel, is something positive or negative. These things, these actions, these feelings are derived from a meaning that we attach to, a meaning that we have in regards to the social world as a whole. So the three main principles of symbolic contractionism: we act towards things based upon the meaning they have for us. And I remember when I was going to grad school in Chicago, and so I lived just off a street compared to in distance to one of the buildings I had a class in. And so usually I'd kind of take the long way to the building, but then there's an alley on my street, like across the street, there's an alleyway. And the first time I decided, why don't I go through this alley to class? And it was a night class, so typically it was dark. The first time I went through the alley, I defined that alley as kind of a shady place, a potentially dangerous place. And based on that definition, I kind of had those feelings of being a little bit timid, a little bit apprehensive of kind of what's going on. But then I redefined that after going through the alley 3 or 4 times and everything being okay, I redefined that alley as a shortcut, something that saved me time. And those kind of negative feelings I had before had disappeared. No longer timid, no longer scared, because I defined that same thing, the alley, as something differently. And based upon that new definition, I acted differently and I felt differently. So in addition to that, we get those meanings through the social interaction. So again, kind of going through the alley multiple times, through those interactions, I learned to define it differently than I originally defined it through my first interaction. And then finally, we can change. And so that third premise is basically we can change and modify meanings like I did. The alley was dangerous compared to the alley is safe and a good shortcut to use. So today what we'll do is move forward into our introduction here and talk about the approaches of different methods of research, and then the approaches to using theory within symbolic interactionism. So when looking at the methodological approaches, I just want to recall two premises that we talked about during our last class, two additional premises that we touched on from chapter 1. The social act should be a unit of study, as well as the research methods used should grasp people's meanings. And so here I just wanted to remind ourselves of these specific ideas because they nicely tie into the methods that are used and the theories that are used within symbolic contractionism. So when looking at methods, you can look at kind of two different general ideas about collecting information, about doing scientific research. And the traditional scientific method typically ties into what we call quantitative research. And that scientific method basically says that you have a problem that you defined and you formulate these hypotheses about the problem, and then you go out and collect information, you collect data, and then with that information you say, my hypotheses were proven to be correct or incorrect, and then you kind of go from there. And then with qualitative research, typically you don't use that traditional scientific method approach. Rather, kind of centered outside of that, as the chapter today says, you look at exploring the topic first. So, obviously you probably have some ideas of what's going on before you go into it. Sometimes maybe you don't have any idea at all, but you kind of go into your kind of interest of study and you explore that. And I remember when I was in grad school, this was in Iowa, when I was studying for my doctorate, I did research for a class. I actually attended different get rich quick seminars. So you don't see them as much today as you did when I was in grad school. They used to be these infomercials where they would promise you'll learn how to get rich quick through real estate or through whatever, and you would go to a certain hotel, the Marriott by the airport, and there'd be a free seminar, and they give you a little bit of a taste of what they'll do for you in terms of giving you the tricks of the trade and how you can get rich quick. And then they make you pay money to go to additional seminars. And so I did that. I went to the free one, then I paid a couple $100, I got from my department, luckily. And I went to kind of these weekend-long 3-day seminars. And so I went into that kind of not really knowing what to expect. So I couldn't define my problem because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to look at. I couldn't formulate hypotheses because, again, it was kind of unknown territory. So my approach to that kind of qualitative research I was doing is first kind of explore it, do research online, go to these seminars, and then collect all this information that I can, and then really break it down, what patterns emerge, what themes emerge. So for example, in these get rich quick schemes, one pattern that emerges is your life sucks. You wouldn't be here if your life didn't suck. A better life. So it was really interesting how basically one strategy they used to get these people to continue to pay money and go to other seminars. So like the next step was like $1,000 seminar. You go to Las Vegas, and I didn't do that. But nevertheless, they basically would degrade, talk down on all the people there attending and say, your life sucks now, but if you continue to go through these seminars and learn how to get rich quick through us, your life's going to be better. You're going to be like us. So again, these things that you just kind of have to be there and kind of go through to find out what's actually going on. So those are the two kind of main approaches. In some symbolic contractionist research, you see the scientific method. In most symbolic contractionism research, because you're interested in kind of the meanings, you're interested in kind of how people use the meanings to kind of get what they want or to motivate them. The approach most often taken is this qualitative approach, kind of centered outside of the traditional scientific method. So kind of hitting on the quantitative and qualitative research again, basically you can distinguish the quantitative from the qualitative in the sense that the quantitative research is about, collecting numbers. It's about, getting different numeric information and kind of crunching the numbers, finding certain demographic changes, looking at certain statistics and stuff like that. And then when you look at qualitative research, it's more about, collecting information that's non-numeric. So observations, different narratives. So you can interview people, you can look at different interviews, and you use those observations to use people's narratives to create your information and do your research. So those two different approaches, and like I mentioned before, most often people are kind of using the non-scientific method because they're using the qualitative research in symbolic contractionism. And again, the idea that the qualitative research is the research approach of choice, it's because they believe they can better understand meaning and meaning making through the qualitative model. So for example, if I'm doing a paper survey, and I fill in, how do you like, how well do you like this class? And neutral, good, very good. You know, when I say good, it may not mean the same thing when somebody else says good. So how much can you really get from that? But when you talk to somebody and you say, "Oh, how did you like that class?" and they say, "I liked it. It was good." So what do you mean? What do you mean when you say good? Why did you like it? You can dig a little bit deeper and really get to the true meaning that somebody has for something that somebody uses for motivation to kind of guide their lives. So that's what you see in kind of getting to specific research methods that are qualitative in nature. You have ethnography, basically, when you're going into the field and kind of experience things for yourself. And you have, similar to ethnography, participant observation. And by participant observation, basically, you're not only observing things like you typically do in ethnography, you're a participant. You're actually going through it yourself. So, for example, when I was doing that Get Rich Quick research, that's the participant observation. I was actually participating in all the activities, going to the seminars. When I was doing my research for my dissertation, I moved to a new town and I would go to different, city council meetings. I'd go to different events, but I was more kind of a wallflower. I wasn't participating. I was just kind of looking at things and taking notes and observing. So although those things overlap a lot, you can distinguish participant observation from ethnography. In the participant observation, you're more kind of involved. Ethnography, you're involved just to a lesser degree. Content analysis is another method of qualitative research used. And basically, the content analysis is, you don't create the information is already there. So you can do an analysis, on different magazines, the sense that you don't create the magazines, as magazines already existed. You can do a content analysis on different television programs, different movies. So basically, there's some type of text, whether it be a visual text or a written text, and you'll analyze that content and try to find, again, different patterns, different meanings, different themes that emerge. Verbal interviews. So again, rather than kind of interviewing somebody in terms of a written interview, you would do a kind of a face-to-face interview with somebody, or sometimes you do like a focus group. But the key dimension here is all kind of verbal in nature, where you talk to people and typically you have questions you want to get at, but often you kind of digress and you go off script a lot, so you can really understand the answers to the questions that you're asking to begin with. And they talk about auto ethnography. That's something that's kind of on the margins. It's not used too often, but since the chapter brought it up, it's kind of this basically, self-analysis. I don't think, as a research method, I don't think it's too good, but nevertheless, some people use it. But overall, we can say often it's a combination of the above. So for example, when I was doing my dissertation research, it was more kind of ethnography. Sometimes I was kind of that participant. I did a lot of interviews with community members. So my qualitative research wasn't this kind of one specific research method. It was a combination of a few. And finally, as I kind of put there before I move forward, often the qualitative research does include quantitative analysis as well. And usually here, what we see, qualitative researchers use what we call descriptive statistics. So going back to my dissertation research, I did, quantitative research in terms of demographic changes, people that were, leaving town because of the social changes that were going on, people who were kind of laid off work, going into new types of work. So, there are a lot of kind of numbers and quantitative analysis, but basically those were secondary to kind of support my qualitative research that I had. And so now we can turn our attention from the methods to now the theories. So in terms of theoretical approaches, again, we can break it down into kind of two different dimensions. The first is grounded theory. So grounded theory is used more often than not when people are kind of looking at social world through that symbolic interactions lens. And grounded theory is basically you're supposed to go into the research not kind of using any kind of preconceived notions, preconceived guides in terms of what you're going to find. Instead, as you kind of are doing the research, as you're conducting your interviews with people, as you're doing your observations, you let different themes, different patterns kind of bubble up from the surface and the ground up. That's why I call it ground theory. Kind of start from the ground, and from the ground, different ideas, different findings will emerge. And ultimately, you can construct a theory in terms of what's going on and why it's going on, because the information tells you what's going on rather than you kind of trying to see the information through a theory. So the grounded theory is the kind of theory of choice within symbolic interactionism, because people believe it's the best approach in terms of letting the meanings emerge on their own rather than you kind of imposing your personal meanings onto something. So that's something you want to avoid is, when somebody is saying something, you interpret them incorrectly, and then your research is going to be incorrect. So when you let the meanings kind of emerge on their own, you can have a better sense of kind of what's going on and why it's going on, and you base your theory on those findings. But on the other hand, you can use theory from the outset. You can have different theories that are already kind of formulated and use those theories to guide your symbolic interactions research. And as I say, often when you see this, you see people who've done grounded theory and come up with their own ideas as a result of their grounded theory, and they use those ideas that they found previously to guide later research. So, both you see, some people will use, you can see symbolic interactionists kind of using maybe like a Durkheimian theory or Marxist theory to, look at the world on the more micro level. But more often than not, what you see is people using the grounded theory to let the information kind of create an overall framework through their research. And so I'll leave that there for today. So we'll get to the second half of chapter 2 in our next class. And then we'll kind of turn the page a little bit to do, more specific readings, more specific information within the symbolic interactions lens. And then also what we're going to do is turn our attention to our first exam, which basically is going to cover the introduction part of the class, the first 2 chapters, as well as, the different lectures that we've done. So I'll leave that there for today. As always, please get in touch if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.